Hello, and welcome to a new episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. This week, we are going to be talking about the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's hearing on the administration's priorities for transportation infrastructure. I'm your host, Margaret Edwards, Policy Associate for Government Relations and Advocacy here at NSPE. Before we dive right into talking about the hearing, I figured we could take a minute to run through some T&I committee fast facts. So the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is one of the largest committees in Congress. There are 6 subcommittees that make up the full committee, which cover the committee's jurisdiction really well. If you take a look at the subcommittees listed, that is a perfect description for what the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee covers. Some of the earliest iterations of an infrastructure committee in Congress date back to the 1830s. The earliest record that I found is the Road and Canals Committee going back to 1831. So it's gone through, multiple iterations and changes in jurisdiction to really become the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that we know today. The current leadership of the committee is Chairman Peter DeFazio from Oregon and Ranking Member Sam Graves from Missouri. So let's talk about the hearing. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg appeared before the full committee to talk about and answer questions on the Biden administration's priorities as it relates to transportation infrastructure. It was clear from his opening as well as Chair DeFazio and ranking members Graves's opening that infrastructure is a bipartisan issue. It's something that both Democrats and Republicans want to do something about this Congress and this year. It was hinted in his opening statement by Chair DeFazio that last year's bill will likely be a starting point for the infrastructure bill this Congress. I think it's important to note, being that, there is willingness on both sides of the aisle to work together on infrastructure. I think that's going to really depend what the final bill looks like and what shape it takes. And there is some urgency to act because the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act funding is set to expire at the end of September. It was set to expire last September, but Congress made the decision to extend the authorization of funds for a single year. So it really needs to get done this September, unless they just extend it. This was not the focus of the hearing, so it's unclear what they're going to do, but it's providing some urgency to actions around infrastructure and a surface transportation bill. So some key takeaways from the hearing. Obviously, there is an expressed interest in trying to find a bipartisan solution for infrastructure. Secretary Buttigieg focused on that in his opening statement, talking about, how there is a need for infrastructure, regardless if you're, a Democrat or Republican living out in the United States. And it was also expressed by ranking member Sam Graves whenever he said that he is ready to come to the table, ready to work with Democrats and, arrive at something that both sides will be happy with. And also there is an interest in electrification and resiliency coming from both sides of the aisle. The approaches are a little bit different. Secretary Buttigieg approaching it from, cutting back carbon emissions, being that, the transportation sector is a large contributor to carbon emissions in the country, with the switching to electrification of vehicles and, increasing a charging infrastructure, obviously being a point to, kind of help combat climate change. But you also have, interest in electrification coming from the Republican side. There was a member who expressed, wanting to increase charging infrastructure for electric vehicles because he has an electric vehicle. There was also a Republican member who raised a question about carbon capture in concrete and new technologies and new techniques that are coming out in that field, in that space, and how the transportation department can implement those options to help with carbon capture. Talking about electrification, I think, is a good pivot to, talk about, there was discussion about the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. I don't think this is something that, is super at the top of the list whenever it comes to infrastructure for professional engineers, but this is going to be a big part of the conversation, being that the gas tax hasn't been raised since 1993, but also with an increase in electric vehicles on the road who aren't paying into the gas tax. What are some, different funding mechanisms that we can have for that? There was talk about a vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, being proposed, and there's questions that come with that, but we certainly can dive into that another time. There were also questions about emerging technologies in transportation. Secretary Buttigieg has said in the past that that the technology is far outpacing the policy. So really, hitting the ground running whenever it comes to creating policies for emerging technologies in the transportation space. NSPE obviously has some interest in this, being that we do have an emerging technology policy guide, and really are going to be looking to see how that conversation continues. Of course, there were other questions asked. Members hit on other points in their questions and their time that they had to engage in discussion with Secretary Buttigieg. But it was a four-plus hour long hearing, and we certainly don't have the time, at least today, to delve into all of the issues that were covered. So these are just some key takeaways that we think that it would be necessary to share with you. And so why does this matter to NSPE and our professional engineer, our PE members? So NSPE does have a policy position on infrastructure, as well as multiple position statements that reside under this policy position. Within this policy position, it states that NSPE advocates for the inclusion of licensed professional engineers in all engineering aspects related to infrastructure. So certainly as legislation is coming together, we're going to be looking for ways to advocate for the inclusion of professional engineers. But as well as, this is going to show what projects are being funded, or new projects that are being funded, or new programs that are going to be available, that really have an impact on the work that PEs are and can be doing. So some next steps is this conversation is obviously going to be continuing. This was not a one and done hearing, like we're done talking about it now. No, this conversation is going to be going on, especially since the administration has a vested interest in it, and Congress has also been showing a lot of interest in this recently. So the timing is right for conversation around infrastructure. So staff, we are of course going to be on the lookout for legislative language to be introduced, and establishing relationships and working on relationships with offices that we already have, such that once legislation is introduced, we can really hit the ground running with advocacy efforts. Also, we're going to be at some point soon looping in you, our NSPE members, to engage with your elected officials, and really make sure that the PE voice is being heard around infrastructure, and making sure that we're making our position known whenever it comes to this infrastructure bill. So with that all being said, tune in next week on Tuesday, April 20th for our next episode. Congress is back in session, so we are going to be, pushing out weekly episodes of the Committee Corner. And you can find us at the NSP Advocacy Center. There's a button that takes you right to the Committee Corner page at the top of your browser window, or on the NSPE YouTube page. So thank you, and join us next time in the Committee Corner.